Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion this evening on intersectional environmentalism. My name is Benjamin Keisling, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory.
And I'm Kailani Acosta. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences.
We would like to thank the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University, as well as the Directorate of Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory for sponsoring tonight's event. We'd like to welcome you to the first event in a series that we're calling Columbia Climate Conversations, highlighting critical topics at the intersection of earth science, sustainability, and environmentalism. Stay tuned for information about future events. I want to start tonight by amplifying the work and the words of the Native American Council at Columbia University, a group that I would encourage everyone to engage with and support. The Lenape lived here before and during the colonization of the Americas. We recognize these indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. This acknowledgement stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward.
So this event was the brainchild of Lauren Ritchie, who is a 19-year-old climate activist, writer, podcast host, and third-year student in sustainable development and political science at Columbia University. She's originally from the Bahamas and is the creator of the EcoGal, which is a digital platform that educates on global climate justice, promotes intersectional climate action, and seeks to make sustainable living more accessible and inclusive by amplifying the voices of marginalized communities. You can learn more about Lauren from her interview in the State of the Planet blog on the Earth Institute website. And we're so excited to host this conversation on intersectional environmentalism this evening and talk more about diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in climate and environmental action. So turning it over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ben and Kailani, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for tuning in today to the first event of Columbia Climate Conversations, which is a series, as Ben and Kailani said, which is going to be tackling a lot of the issues that we haven't heard talked about before, which is extremely exciting. So we have a great conversation lined up for all of you today, all about intersectional environmentalism and basically ways to increase the amount of representation and diversity within the environmental sciences, and also promoting a more inclusive approach to climate action. So we also have some phenomenal panelists lined up for this discussion tonight. So I will allow them to introduce themselves and let you all get to know a little bit more about them and their work. And yes, I'm very excited for this conversation today. So if the panelists could all turn on their cameras. And Tori, why don't you kick us off with your introduction?
My name is Tori Choi and I use she, her, they pronouns. I'm based in Bristol in the UK, so calling in from here late at night, but I'm a night owl anyway. And I'm originally from Hong Kong and I identify as an intersectional climate activist. I originally studied conservation sciences at university and was actually due to do a PhD when I decided actually that I was more passionate about communications. So I moved to Bristol here in the UK to work kind of within the wildlife filmmaking world. So I worked on some BBC productions. I did some digital stuff for Blue Planet 2. And, you know, that was kind of my bread and butter for a while. And from that, I basically, delved into climate activism. And then through a series of different, trajectories, I ended up really trying to champion intersectional environmentalism within the climate movement here in the UK. Because as we hopefully already know, the climate movement and specifically activism is not nearly inclusive enough and does not necessarily advocate for the lives of most marginalized people in areas. And so my work really focuses on engaging people here in the UK specifically to really think about who their climate activism is for, and how they can use their voices and their privileges to advocate for most marginalized people and areas.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Tori. Christy, why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Drutman. I'm based here in Oakland, California, which is on Ohlone Indigenous land here in the Bay Area in California, where it's not as cold as some other parts of the world. And I am the host and founder of my podcast and media series, Brown Girl Green. So I'm a podcast creator, a creative, a digital consultant. I do storytelling, I do diversity and equity consulting. I'm very passionate about this topic. A lot of my work for the past 3 years since I launched my media platform has centered on intersectional environmentalism, specifically uplifting the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color environmentalists from around the world whose voices and stories are not included in the mainstream climate conversation. So I'm really excited to be here and to continue building, these kinds of community and media spaces to have these very critical conversations.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Adithy Meyer. I am based out of Los Angeles, so Tongva land. I am a sustainable fashion blogger, a photojournalist, and labor rights activist. And my work looks a lot at the fashion industry through a lens of decolonization and intersectionality. I had my start in this space about 6-7 years ago. And what I really wanted to challenge was going beyond this conversation of conscious consumerism, but really questioning the histories of colonialism and colonial models that continue to reign supreme in so many industries today. So I want to thank you all so much for having me today. This is another dream panel with some folks I admire deeply. I'm excited to dive in deeper.
Thank you all for those introductions and letting us all know about the amazing work that you're all doing. I think just as a question to kind of kick us off and kind of ground this conversation, what did all of your introductions to sustainability and environmentalism look like? I think for a lot of us, especially within this space, our introduction to getting into climate activism or learning more about why it's so important to care about our planet looked very different. So for all of you who are now champions for intersectional environmentalism, how did you really get your start, or what piqued your interest?
I can start. And I mentioned that I grew up in Hong Kong, which is renowned for being a cosmopolitan, bustling city, but it actually has a lot of natural landscapes and a lot of wildlife as well. And I was really fortunate enough to grow up in the countryside. But by proxy of the fact that I grew up in the countryside, I was actually on the border with mainland China, in an area specifically called Shenzhen, where a lot of manufacturing takes place. And most of this manufacturing would actually be for countries in the global north. So it was pretty common for us to experience toxic levels of air pollution. Also, there were landfills pretty near the border as well, which would obviously result in runoff and really, really toxic hazardous land around the areas where lots of people live, especially the most marginalized of Hong Kong's communities. So for me, there was always this, necessity to talk about these topics. And growing up, it was almost, it was on my doorstep in many ways. So that was kind of where my first foray into environmentalism came from, in school, campaigning, and then also notoriously from that part of the world, a lot of wildlife trafficking. So that's kind of where the conservation aspect came in. So Hong Kong, for instance, is really famous for its ivory trade, as a sort of a gateway to mainland China as well, and also for shark finning. So I was really, really interested in the effects of the shark finning trade on conservation. So that's kind of where the real root of it is. And then moving to the UK, working in the wildlife industry, I actually just found that they didn't talk enough about the climate crisis. So I went from falling in love with conservation to actually thinking, hang on a second, first of all, you're not talking about the climate crisis in a way that it deserves to be talked about. And secondly, you're not talking about the people who are going to be affected by this. And that's kind of when I, veered straight into quote unquote more radical activism, which there's nothing radical about advocating for people's humanity and lives. So yeah, that's just a whistle-stop tour of my little introduction to environmentalism and advocacy.
My journey was a bit untraditional. I did not grow up in much of a natural space. I grew up in a very small town that was very conservative in Southern California. Was not really exposed to environmental issues, didn't really grow up with much environmental education or exposure. I knew caring about the planet in theory was an important thing, but it didn't feel very tangible to me. But I was I want to study this. This seems really important. I'm interested in that. So I went to UC Berkeley and was oh, I'm going to study environmental issues. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time. And then I just kind of got thrown into activist spaces because people saw like me like, oh, I'm this like freshman in college, like I'm gonna pull her in, she seems passionate, which I'm really grateful for because it exposed me to learning about so many different environmental injustices that were happening that I felt really, you know, blocked out from growing up in such a conservative small town suburbia in America. And I just wasn't exposed to those things. And then later on in my freshman year of college was when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. And, you know, that was the first time where I was like, whoa, like I have family in the Philippines, like this is real, like this is actually impacting people I care about. And I actually need to pay attention to this. And actually, Yep Sano, who is like a very famous climate activist in the Philippines, went on a hunger strike at COP, at the United Nations Conference of the Parties. I was like, oh, make sure I don't get that wrong. And he went on a hunger strike because he was like, we can't have these climate negotiations unless the Philippines is, you know, at the forefront of people's minds. And that really woke me up to this is a serious issue and there's people putting their lives on the line. And I wanted to figure out, well, that's really important, but where do I fit into that conversation? And so it was a lot of me exploring my identity, a lot of me exploring like what it meant to, yeah, be a Filipino environmentalist, but not seeing other people who look like me in the space be like that. And so my sustainability journey now, you know, as we go more into this panel, went into talking about and exploring intersectionality in my work. But it started with the Philippines. And, you know, as some people here may know, 2 typhoons just hit the Philippines. Actually, there's more than 2, but the 2 big ones just hit the biggest storms of the year. And so the Philippines still remains one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis. And that's one of my biggest investments in the fight.
Awesome. So I had my unofficial start in sustainability from a very young age, both as a cultural norm and economic necessity, growing up as a child of immigrants, first gen, low income. But officially, I had my foray into sustainability through the fashion industry in 2013, when I learned about the Rana Plaza factory collapse, which was an 8-story garment factory producing for some of the world's biggest fast fashion labels out of Bangladesh. And when Rana Plaza collapsed, it was literally considered the biggest industrial disaster of our time. It killed over 1,100 people and injured over 2,500. And for me at that time, I was at the start of my college career, a young freshman. And I think, you know, Rana Plaza very much catalyzed a shift of looking fashion through the politics of labor, understanding the environmental impacts, but more so being a South Asian woman, really understanding how colonialism fed into this legacy and still continues to be part of that today. And then on top of that, being born and raised in SoCal in Los Angeles, seeing a lot of the immigrant workforce that made up the local Los Angeles garment industry was my own community as well. And a lot of those sweatshop conditions were found in my own backyard. So all of these questions kind of informed, you know, using fashion as a vehicle. And that kind of led to, you know, greater conversations of sustainability and environmentalism in all different senses. I think fashion very much frames my understanding of land and labor through a lens of intersectionality as well. And being the granddaughter of Punjabi farmers, understanding the impacts of things like the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s in India, where we had this shift from sustenance farming to monocrop and just output-oriented farming. So as much as sustainability was about this interrogation of larger systems of oppression and power, it became a very personal exploration of decolonization in the personal sense and trying to understand this ancestral knowledge and wisdom really through the perspective of my grandparents, but also a pre-colonial period in India. And so going forward, a lot of my work in 2021 is going to be doing that. I'm really excited to be a part of this fellowship with National Geographic. So next year we'll be spending 1 year in India, just exploring the social and environmental impacts of the Indian fashion supply chain, starting from agriculture, manufacturing to end of life. So that's a bit of my conception story.
Thank you, 3, for all of that. I think it's so interesting how pretty much all of your introductions really came from understanding that intersection of how the climate impacts people, which I think is so, so important for this conversation that we're having today around intersectionality and around the importance of social justice and environmentalism. And I think over the past few months, especially, this concept of intersectional environmentalism has something that's become more of a buzzword or something that people are talking a lot about, but people might not exactly understand what it truly means. So in your own words, what does intersectional environmentalism really mean to you? And on top of that, why is it so important that we talk about it and we prioritize it?
I want to kind of start by talking about something called climate justice, which I'm sure many people have heard about. And, my sort of introduction to climate activism was through a very climate justice centric lens. And climate justice is essentially advocating for most marginalized people and areas and trying to think about the systems of oppression that have harmed so many marginalized people, but have also given rise to the climate crisis. And, I think that intersectionality and climate justice are cut from the same cloth. They are all about thinking about the way that systems of oppression interact with one another to produce these causes and effects of what we're experiencing at the moment. And I really believe that, a lot of people, kind of just as like an anecdotal thing, a lot of people in the streets here in the UK and also abroad in other sort of Eurocentric spaces that I've been in, climate-wise, always chant climate justice, but they don't actually know what it means and they don't really advocate for what it stands for. And now I'm seeing more and more people make sense of intersectionality and see how that feeds into climate justice. And I'm seeing a shift in the climate justice movement where more privileged people are actually advocating for more marginalized folks because they're understanding intersectionality. And I feel like you have to understand how these systems overlap. You have to recognize your privileges. You have to recognize where others are more marginalized. I know it's very nuanced, but for me, intersectionality is almost like a gateway in many ways for people in the climate justice movement to make sense of what they're actually advocating for. I always say to people around me who are in these climate spaces, if you're not advocating for the world's most marginalized or most marginalized communities, who is this climate activism even for? So for me, that's kind of what my take on intersectionality is within the climate perspective. And also to just, ground this by saying that intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She is an amazing scholar and a Black feminist as well, who originally, used the term to talk about how her lived experiences as a Black woman intersected with race. And so I think it's really important for me in this space of intersectional climate activism to recognize its roots and recognize that so much of the labor of understanding these perspectives comes from the labor of Black and brown women. And so, yeah, I think to adopt those terms, it's also really important to know where they come from and how they came about, because it's the people who had to experience, all of these oppressive systems overlapping who were able to make sense of this for others as well.
I guess we're going in the same order. Okay, I'll go again. For me, I think the way I define intersectionality and intersectional environmentalism through like my work is just like similar to what Tori said, just like creating, spaces of accessibility, the opposite of gatekeeping. It's creating paths and opportunities for more people with more, a plethora of diverse voices and perspectives to have a seat at the table. And not just a seat at the table in terms of, oh, we have this space in the room, but they're actually given like resources, they're given voice, they're given acknowledgement to shape the conversation of environmental decision making and action. And I think that there's a really big thing to distinguish there because, you can bring so many Black, brown people into a room, but if you don't actually give them the support and resources and space necessary to feel like they can actually thrive, you're not really, what are you doing? And in my opinion, I think it's about like allowing people to feel like they can bring their full selves to this work. And I think previously a lot of people, due to a very racist history of the environmental movement and the conservation movement, especially here in the United States, many people did not feel like they could bring their whole selves to this work. They did not feel included. They felt uncomfortable due to a variety of things, whether that be microaggressions, to being intimidated, to just feeling like their voice didn't matter. And so I would say intersectional environmentalism is really like dialing back, recognizing there needs to be a slowdown to be more intentional, that we can't just skip the race stuff to focus on climate. The race stuff is core to actually resolving and creating climate solutions that are going to actually be regenerative, and that at the end of the day, it's going to bring more people strategically into this cause. And if you exclude that messaging, like, we're not going to be able to shift these mainstream narratives. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And adding on to everything that Tori and Christy said, I always think of intersectionality as the biodiversity of thought. The fact that our markers of identity are key in forming our personal relationship with the environment, especially when you ground this in an understanding of environmental justice, right? The fact that at least here in the US, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately located next to toxic waste sites, freeways, and other things that directly affect their health. And so I think that's the first thing to acknowledge here. And I think the other thing is sustainability can't be a monolithic thing. There are so many perspectives that inform our understanding of ecological wisdom. And a lot of that has been overlooked based on this gatekeeping that Christy was speaking about, especially the value that has historically been given to certain voices based on Western notions of credibility, often based in education rather than lived experience. And so I think it's also kind of reorienting our understanding of what is credible, who deserves that voice. And it goes into, in terms of tangible action, how do we give those communities stakeholdership and agency in this space and go beyond the face value politics of diversity and inclusion as well?
Thank you all. I think that was extremely insightful. And I think, what the three of you have just shared really, really emphasizes the importance of this and why these conversations need to be held. And I think in that vein, it kind of, I guess, asks the question, why has it taken so long for intersectional environmentalism to become, so mainstream? I think, as Tori was saying, and how intersectional environmentalism and climate justice go hand in hand, why has it taken so long for the environmental community to embrace intersectionality?
I think this is a great question to piggyback off what Adithy was saying, because there is so much gatekeeping in the environmental world, even to this day, even that, there are more mainstream conversations around intersectional environmentalism and intersectionality in general. People are still kind of questioning the validity of it. And those same people are the same people who've held onto that power for so long within the environmental movement. I think part of it is to do with power. All of these systems of oppression thrive off disproportionate power. And when you have certain individuals who hold on to their power within a particular space or a movement, and they're not willing to give up that power, that's when you're limiting conversations. And, even myself as a light-skinned woman of color living in the global north, originally from the global south, there is still a lot of power and privilege that I have in the environmental movement as a light-skinned woman of color. The fact that I'm educated, the fact that I'm, can speak English as a fluent language, provides me this space of palatability. And I recognize that within the environmental movement, I'm still part of the problem, when in reality, what we have to be doing is, as an environmentalist, I know I need to give up my power. I know I need to make space for other people to talk. I know I need to dedicate my time and my advocacy to causes where, others don't necessarily have the same opportunities. And so I think, just as my personal example and other examples in the environmental movement, so much of it is down to gatekeeping and power and people thinking that, this is a singular sort of like movement where one person speaks. It's a collective. And I think we're seeing the same patterns reoccurring in the environmental movement as in any movement that we have, where we have few individuals who are spotlighted rigorously. And in the context of climate activism, Greta is a classic example. I love the work that she does. there's obviously so much that so many climate activists are grateful for, but it's more the media and the world love to capitalize on this one white young girl, because it's a narrative that holds on to that same power, and we need to start dismantling that. And that's, for me at least, why so many of these conversations don't make it to the fore, because people like Greta aren't necessarily going to champion intersectionality from a perspective that they understand from their lived realities and experiences. But, you know, we have amazing climate activists like Vanessa Nakate, who's become more renowned recently for being cut out of a photo with Isabella Axelson and Greta and some other climate activists like Louisa Neubauer. So those are the conversations that we're missing, because these people keep being cut out of the conversation, and because, you know, there are a lot of white climate activists who take center stage. And so, at least from the climate activist perspective, or like the climate justice realm, that's kind of why these conversations, you know, are not at the fore of the climate movement.
I would say that a lot of people have struggled to see the value of intersectional environmentalism because of exactly what Tori was saying, because of who has held on to these narratives and which organizations, nonprofits, and companies alike have received majority of the funding and investment on what people think are the solutions to climate change. And the distribution of resources is alarming. I mean, you're seeing here in the US, some of these very big green NGOs are receiving, you know, millions and millions of dollars. And you see these environmental justice organizations having to like run a Kickstarter, or having to like literally do a GoFundMe to like raise money for someone in their community. And you just see that and you're like, these are the people that are protecting their communities. Not saying that like these big green NGOs aren't doing that work, or they don't have intentional partnerships with some of those groups, but like you have to think about those things. You have to think, well, what is the bottom line of even these nonprofits? What are they trying to accomplish? What are the metrics they're measuring for progress? And do brown and Black people actually fit into that story? Not always. Not always. In terms of like giving up power and giving them resources to like own that space, you know what I mean? And I think that there's an amazing report that I recommend folks check out. It's called the Green 2.0 report here in the US, that details the lack of diversity and inclusion in environmental nonprofits here in the US. And it shows that just a very insignificant amount of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, are in positions of power and leadership in environmental nonprofits and foundations. And that will decide what projects get prioritized, what communities get invested in, and who gets the mainstream media, who gets these press releases. Because as a media professional, I can tell you firsthand that like, if you don't have like straight up PR professionals or people who really know how to do this stuff, there's so many barriers to entry, especially for Black and brown communities, to get that space, to get that opportunity to have their stories heard. And, you know, from my experience as someone who's, you know, try to have a media platform that's more grassroots to try to uplift those voices, there's a lot of barriers that I even experienced as a brown woman who's trying to do something that like is new. And I think for me, from my own experiences, there's been so many barriers to entry where people like even have policing around what is considered journalism versus activism. And a lot of the stuff we talk about with environmental justice or climate justice is viewed as activism, when it should be viewed as straight up journalism and what's going on in the world. It's like little subtle things like that that are microaggressions that continue to suppress the information distribution about these issues and what communities are actually going through. So that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, and going back to like why it's taken the environmental community so long to embrace intersectionality, I think it's also important to note that the genesis of the environmental and conservation movement were rooted in white supremacy and the erasure of BIPOC communities. So whether that is the heroes of the transcendentalism movement, right? People like John Muir and Thoreau. These are folks that were really honing in on ideas like the pristine myth as, you know, the US and the Western frontier as the last sites of pure wilderness that had to be protected, even though they were the homes of Indigenous folks. And this was the same sort of thinking that led to, undermining the importance of cultural burns, which we now know are so key to preserving the environment. And this history of countless incidents of settler colonialism is seen throughout the world based on undermining indigenous knowledge and having European understandings of codified property rights a lot of the time too. I think about Australia when European colonizers came and they established the idea of terra nullius, nobody's land, despite the fact that Torres Strait people were living there for 65,000 years. I think about in Europe, the Catholic Church developed the doctrine of discovery that basically made it that if someone's way of living did not align with the Western notions of what was considered the right way of living, they can, dispossess them of their lands. Me personally, I think of India during the period of British colonization, where when it came to farming, Indian farming culture was not rooted in Western understandings of private land ownership. It was about shared land and shared irrigation and cultivation and how that was erased. And so I think we can't move forward without understanding where we are. And with that, we have to know where we've been. And so acknowledging that history and the damage that has been done is so key in moving forward. So constantly centering these histories and the erasure that has taken place is key in really making sure that environmentalism of the future, like intersectionality, is a baseline understanding rather than like this add-on that we have to kind of like continue with.
Amazing. And I think that's also a great segue into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, is what you were talking about in terms of the real racist and eugenic roots of the environmental movement, especially like the early American environmental movement, and what is really the traces of what we see now in this, not really moving towards intersectionality, and how that can be traced back into history. And for the audience as well, there's a great article in the New Yorker by Jedediah Purdy that goes into all of environmentalism's racist history. And I think in that vein, as Adithy was saying, it's so important to acknowledge this. And I think as a question for all of you, how would you like to see the environmental movement, especially thinking of environmental organizations like the Sierra Club recently came out with a statement trying to address their racist history as well. But how would you like for the environmental movement to move forward, acknowledging this racist and exclusionary history? And I guess kind of as a two-part question, what are some of the broader improvements that you want to see made on the global stage regarding intersectionality and representation, diversity, and inclusion, and all of these things that we've been discussing?
So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is, some of you may have seen that Pass the Mic campaign that we were working on, which was all about kind of encouraging David Attenborough, or rather his team, to give up his Instagram to most marginalized people in areas, MAPA folks from the Global South, to speak about some of their lived realities and to advocate, for climate justice. And this has led me to being in some rooms with people from WWF, who, I'm sure many of us know have had some rather contentious, messaging about different things, have had, deeply racist sort of roots in environmental activism. And it's going to be interesting to see how these organizations move forward as these conversations become more common. But one of the things that I've come to realize is part of this is having people in a room with those who are major facilitators of these environmental organizations to call them out. Never in a million years would I have ever thought that these people would actually want to sit down and talk to some of the participants that we have from the Global South, calling them out about things that they've been perpetuating about overpopulation, specifically with regards to BIPOC communities in the Global South. This is the first step in the sort of realm that I'm working in at the moment, having these conversations, and these people who are part of these organizations also realizing that they have to be accountable for these actions. And for me, I want to see more BIPOC people talking to these organizations, being fairly compensated for their time with these organizations, and advising them as to how to, move forward and actually change the way that they talk about environmentalism or the environmental sort of campaigns and projects that they do. Because if you look at most of these organizations, you know, a lot of them are very wealthy. We recently saw who Jeff Bezos was paying as part of his climate fund. They're all big, you know, very, very white supremacist environmental organizations who undoubtedly will not have good representation of different voices. So I would love to see steps in that direction of getting people into these organizations who have these lived realities and perspectives. And, you know, as was previously mentioned, acknowledging the history. It doesn't go away. It never will go away. We have to acknowledge what they have done, what damage has been done, because if you don't recognize sort of like the root cause of everything and the sort of histories of oppression, then you can't move forward, you know, in a sort of safe space way for BIPOC communities without actually tackling this.
Yeah, I just think that a lot of organizations need a better DEI approach, and not just, and it can't just be like, oh, we hired a diversity and equity consultant. Like, there needs to be actual transparency on their website on what goals are they actually setting and tracking on that. And if they're not, like, there should be more call outs. There should be more people calling out these organizations, because a lot of times it's like, oh, these fossil fuel companies, these like, you know, very big conglomerates are like very evil, and that's where we need to focus. And yes, at the end of the day, like, we need to shift that. And of course, like, you know, the whole concept of like infighting is always like brought up. It's like, oh, we shouldn't be fighting against each other. We're all fighting for the same thing. Sure, but also like you need to be held accountable to the pain that's being caused. The frustration, Black and brown people leaving your organizations, and you're not doing anything about it besides making us replaceable and finding someone who is willing to just like suck it up and deal with the mistreatment. And I just think that you're not accomplishing much by doing that, because the fabric, especially as we continue to evolve into a more multicultural society, is your organization is going to continue to unravel. Like, people are going to continue to challenge you. So you might as well start to develop the processes now before you like end up on a front page of Politico and get called out by all these, you know, different people in press to smear your organization and ruin your reputation. So I don't know. I just think there's preventative measures that a lot of organizations could take to like be very intentional and obvious. I think something tangible is also developing something like a youth advisory board, that's not just like, oh, the youth are just like making some cute social media posts. Like, no, our opinions and like our statements, especially from BIPOC youth, are actually being brought into decision-making processes and brought to the leaders, and they're actually considering that. In an ideal world, that's like what I would like to see, because I just think that, especially for people in our generation, we understand this concept so intuitively, honestly, or it just like makes sense from my opinion of the circles that I've been in, at least, to where like I think we deserve a spot to be in leadership, and we don't need to like, you know, climb up the ladder and follow any of these like white supremacists, like, you know, we need to get to this point of the hierarchy and then we can like actually make change. We don't have time for that. We do not have time for that anymore. We have to be able to create more distributed power structures. And that starts by holding these organizations and companies accountable to the fact that they're missing this very clear gap.
Yeah, I think Tori and Christy hit it in the head. I think the example you gave, Lauren, of the Sierra Club is actually very huge. The fact that they went ahead and acknowledged this history, to the dismay of a lot of their white followers who are very of like, that was a different time. That's not the point. What's wrong is wrong. And it's so important to acknowledge that history. And again, I'm thinking about ownership and accountability as step one of like these histories. But going forward, you know, I'm not sure what happened at Sierra Club, but I'd be interested in looking at their leadership as a next step after, you know, that point. And it goes back into shifts in ownership, stakeholdership, and agency. As much as it is important to look at these bigger players and organizations in the environmental landscape, there are so many smaller scale grassroots initiatives that have been inherent to BIPOC communities that we really need to acknowledge. And I think there's a lot of great resources, intersectionalenvironmentalist.com being one of like collecting these, leaders or organizations that people can support. Because I think a very common question or comment that I hear is like, oh, I want to support, but I don't know where to start. And I think people just, do their Googles and just get more involved, because the folks that are doing the work and have been doing the work are out there. And it goes back into resource distribution or redistribution, as Christy was saying.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you all for that. And I think just as kind of a final question before we get into some of the great questions that we have from our audience, how can our audience address the systems that we were talking about of oppression that are responsible for a lot of this environmental injustice that we're talking about? And what advice would you have for those who want to be more involved in climate justice and promoting intersectionality?
I think given the time that we're in at the moment, I mean, it's obviously been such a difficult year for so many people and so many marginalized people in particular. If there's one thing that I think I'm really grateful for during this time is the unification of so many different movements through online means, pursuing different lines of climate action, and also, the collaborative nature of this online realm that we have. Just me being in the UK, for instance, and being able to attend this panel, the project that I'm currently working on with Latin American and Caribbean youth, Building Bridges for Climate Action, which is facilitated by Klima Delegation in Germany. These things are huge. And who knows if this would have necessarily come about due to COVID. I mean, it's obviously not something I would ever want the future of climate activism to look like per se, but this time has really given people the opportunity to rethink what a better future looks like. And I really do believe that there is so much power in online advocacy. And I think that, obviously, Marie Beecham talked a little bit about slacktivism the other day, and how we need to make sure that we're transforming this online activism into real tangible change. And that's really important. But I also think that as part of that, we can galvanize, momentum, work together as communities. And I think that for anyone who's kind of at the beginning of their journey, there are so many online resources, so many community pages. The Instagram realm in itself has incredible, resources. Adithy mentioned Intersectional Environmentalism, which it spearheads this whole, conversation that we're talking about in this panel. And these communities are fundamental for education, for involvement, and there are ways to uplift and support people through their individual means. I know that I am a huge fan of Christy's stuff, and compensate the people that you learn from, elevate their voice, share their content, because these people are educators and they're also really driving the movement. And if that's something that you feel like you have capacity to contribute to in that way, then I would really recommend that. Or find your local grassroots organization or project that may be, operating online at the moment. Find something that you are passionate about, and find how that injustice or passion intersects with other, oppressive systems. Because the sad thing is it intersects with everything. Oppressive systems affect every single advocacy cause that we want to, change or move forward with. So find something that really you care about, and look at how this affects your local communities, specifically the most marginalized people in areas.
Yeah, I would just say that also, we need so many more storytellers. We need so many people who are creating their own platforms for their own communities to talk about why you care about these issues. And I think, digital tools are becoming more and more accessible every day. And I think it's a vulnerable thing to put your story out there and to be able to share your perspective on things, but you never know how your story is going to impact other people. And I think it's important that we have more of these dinner table-esque kind of conversations where it's not just, oh, those are the environmental people, they're gonna solve the issue. It's like, no, we all have a role in it. We all have to have a role in it. And I think that especially for Black and brown folks out there, like I didn't feel like my voice was important for a long time. And it was a moment of me being like, well, I know at the end of the day, my story is going to help someone else. And so I'm going to share it. And I think that that has helped a lot of people. And it doesn't matter if you have 2 followers, if you have 2 million followers, like we need people who are spreading this information as widely as possible to make it more accessible. It's always about accessibility, not creating these pedestals for others. Like we want these conversations to penetrate all different sectors, all different realms. And the only way we can do that is if people from so many different diverse backgrounds and communities like partake in that. I would say also just, you know, if you come from a white environmental organization or company, consider redistributing your funds somehow. If you're profiting off of some sale of some sort of merch, consider redistributing that to Black and Indigenous groups that are protecting the land, protecting their people. And my final reminder is that there's been people who are on the ground doing environmental justice work for decades. So this isn't new. And so I'd recommend also trying to research, Google what environmental justice groups or racial justice groups are located in your area and start trying to build those intentional relationships. Again, a vulnerable, awkward thing, but we need more people building those relationships to figure out how you can plug in. And it's just a quick Google search and I'm sure you can find it. And a lot of those people are strapped for capacity and money. And so they need volunteers, they need people to support. And yeah, and make sure if you do invite people like me on your panels and things like that, and other Black and brown people to compensate them, because yeah, we're doing extra labor. So yeah.
I love that, Christy. When it goes into folks that want to be more involved in the environmental space, I always like to say, just pick your lane. You know, intersectionality as a framework can be and should be applied to so many touch points. So whether your thing is tech, engineering, fashion for me, you know, continue with that. And there is always an environmental lens to everything because everything intersects, as we talked about. I love what Tori was saying about honing in your locality. The power of local community building, the power of local politics is so, so key. For instance, I remember when I first entered the sustainable fashion scene here in Southern California, I can't tell you how many microaggressions or instances I've had where going into spaces of predominantly well-off white women saying like, oh, are you here from India to represent the brand? Or always having the idea of labor exploitation as this far distant reality, or going on trips to India to help certain communities. And so I think we need to divest from narratives of white saviorism or saviorism in general. And the fact, like in those instances, there was so many instances of sweatshop conditions and environmental degradation happening in our backyard in LA. So it's kind of widening your understanding of lived experience where you are. You don't have to cross borders to do that. And I think the most influential, impactful things really have to be done where you are planted. So yeah, that's what I would say is pick your lane and focus on your own locality.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for that. So in the last 10 minutes, we do have a lot of questions from the audience. We won't be able to touch on them all, but one of them that is about the sustainable fashion industry is kind of, I guess, understanding how to support sustainable fashion or enjoy fashion without impacting countries negatively that depend on the garment industry. So this question particularly is talking about, you know, maybe fashion brands that will say that they're being more sustainable because they'll put their factories, you know, in the West instead of in the global South. But then there are also those countries that depend on that garment industry economically and financially to support workers. So I guess trying to understand how to balance those two sides of the coin. So anyone feel free to answer.
Yeah, for this, I would say that we need to go beyond these binaries of factories in the West being inherently good versus something in the East, because as a lot of my work is actually grassroots organizing in the LA garment sector, where we have folks making as low as 2 to 3 cents per piece they make. And so I would say it requires more research on the consumer's end to really understand that when brands are using these words of ethical or sustainable, what does that mean in practice, right? Show not, or tell not show, or wait, that doesn't apply here, never mind. But in terms of, things abroad, we need to go beyond this understanding of, well, if I stop supporting them, even if they're doing things in a less ethical way, I'm hurting that, because there is a difference between empowerment and exploitation in this context. So it goes back to asking those questions. And there are certain certifications, third party, that you can do, but I found that the brands that are actually doing the work are always open to answering those questions in detail of what does a living wage mean in this context? What is fair pay or ethical working condition? I would say another thing to do is really looking for BIPOC owned brands, because a lot of the times folks that are creating supply chains in environments or locations that they know is so key. So there's a lot of great regenerative fashion brands in India that are popping up that are creating full supply chains where farmers own the land and brands lease that land from those farmers. And on the same sites, they have natural dyeing and block printing. So in those instances, you could definitely shoot me a message and I could give you a list. I'm currently curating a resource or sustainable shop list with predominantly BIPOC owned brands that I'll be sharing in the week to come, which would kind of help with that research and finding the right brands to support.
Okay, maybe I'll go on to the next question. I think in conversations that we find a lot of the time about intersectionality, I think we also find that allyship is something that really goes hand in hand. So in terms of thinking about privilege, I think there are two sides of the coin. Is one, how do you approach someone with a lot of privilege, and what's the best way to get them to be an ally or to be an advocate for intersectionality, especially if it's someone who's been historically unwilling to participate in such conversations in the past. And then I think the other side of the coin is, as well, as a person who has a certain amount of privilege, how do you amplify the work that's already been done, or how can you function as a good ally in those spaces?
Yeah, I just want to offer that there's actually, I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's actually like a very big like youth network of like people who come from generational wealth who are like working to redistribute that money to Black and Brown communities. I forget the name of it, but you can, I think it's a Google search, you could probably find it. It's somewhere on the internet. But there are people who are specifically doing that right now. I would say that like, ideally those people are mobilizing to find more of these communities. Oh, resource generation, thank you, it's called resource generation. Ideally like those folks from resource generation would like be the ones mobilizing those folks, because I feel like it would be very difficult if you came from a different socioeconomic background to mobilize people between those gaps, especially someone who has more economic privilege than you. But I mean, I don't know, I've never approached it honestly, but I think that could be a good resource. And I'd say also for allies, like I said before, if you can in any way figure out how you can like collaborate and uplift like a Black or Brown account, a Black or Brown business, figuring out like how to compile those lists and amplify those businesses before just like jumping to promoting only white sustainable businesses or companies or initiatives. I think that that's a great way. So using your online platforms, also just like, like creating giveaways and things to raise money and redistribute funds. Like these are all things that we need folks to be pledging to do.
Within the environmental movement in the UK, this is something that I think is becoming a conversation that is, becoming more popular, I'd say. It should have happened a long time ago, but now people are becoming more concerned with being inclusive, because if we look at the environmental movement, it's largely dominated by white people. That's not to say that there aren't environmentalists out there from Black, Brown, people of color communities. And I think that within the realms of an environmental movement, specifically the climate movement, we need to make sure that we are centering Black, Brown, and other POC and Indigenous voices in conversations, because so often we find that we're literally in an echo chamber where we listen to the same voices all the time saying the same things. It's not to say that these environmental messages aren't important, but the only way that you're going to break the cycle is if you actually center the voices that are not being represented in this movement. And I always want to be wary of, when there are people in the environmental movement, specifically from Black and Brown communities, who are kind of asked to educate white folks, I'm really conscious that like that is labor, and for a lot of people it's trauma as well. So I actually think that allies should be the ones who are responsible for the most part for educating others if they want to be more you know, understanding of intersectionality and injustice and systems of oppression. Obviously, like if you're going to work with somebody from a marginalized background, center them, pay them, compensate them. You cannot, you know, like go about asking someone to talk about what is effectively trauma in many ways without compensating them. But if you want to have these conversations with folks who are perhaps more hesitant or not very familiar with them, then please make sure that you're not essentially thrusting someone who is BIPOC into these uncomfortable situations if they didn't sign up for it, because that is expected too often of people of color. They're expected to just teach others without any compensation. So if you're an ally, please make sure that you're thinking about that and you're conscious of that. And if you have pre-existing knowledge, share that with your communities, share that with people that perhaps are a little bit more difficult to connect to with regards to these conversations.
And I think just as a final concluding question, I think as we were talking about before with how long it's taken for there to be, you know, diversity and representation within the climate spaces, there are a lot of BIPOC folks who just feel like environmentalism or the environmental movement as it stands now just wasn't made for them, and it's not something that they can be a part of. And I think one of the questions really sparked me to think about that, because they were talking about, you know, how there is a certain distrust or reluctance for BIPOC to get involved in climate activism because it is so whitewashed. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on maybe the most positive or effective ways to engage BIPOC communities in having these conversations and to make them feel more seen, or maybe examples of approaches that have gained, you know, trust from a BIPOC community, especially regarding, you know, when we see a lot of white saviorism in terms of like approaches to climate action that don't really involve maybe community-based or grassroots type approaches to climate activism. So in that vein, what are your thoughts on engaging BIPOC folks to feel seen within this movement?
I just quickly want to give a little example of where I think this, you know, has been spoken about in my life. I recently did a panel in London with an amazing production company, a Black-owned and led production company based in London as well. And I was speaking to their casting director, and she was saying, you know, for a Black woman, I should probably think more about the climate because that's probably going to affect me. You know, I'm a Black Lives Matter activist here in the UK. I speak a lot about racial injustice, and you know, you're kind of like one of the first climate activists that I've spoken to, and I feel like I should care about climate activism. And I thought to myself, like when she said that, I was like, you are already a climate activist, like whether or not you realize it. Like if you are advocating for Black lives, you are effectively someone who is part of the climate justice movement. And I think part of this narrative is breaking down what climate activism looks like and what it means, because so often people who work within the social justice movement see their work and their efforts as completely separate from climate justice and environmental justice. And now every time I speak to people who are like, oh, well, you know, I'm doing this and I'm not really advocating for the climate, I'm like, if you're advocating for marginalized communities and you are standing up for these advocacies, like you are effectively a climate activist. So for me, it's about shifting the perception of what it actually means to be a climate activist, because so often it's been defined by white spaces, and that needs to change.
And adding on to that, I think a core of like climate activism or just frameworks of intersectionality, at its core, we are fighting white supremacy because that is linked to colonialism, which is rooted in extraction and exploitation of people, the natural environment, of labor. So once we have that, you know, unifying framework of understanding that in many ways it is white supremacy that we are kind of fighting hand in hand with all of these issues, it just widens the scope of who is an activist, what that work looks like, as Tori was saying. And I think that framing is really key and important to note, because Christy said it earlier, race was always seen as a distraction to this movement, whereas now we're realizing it's fundamental in understanding why certain communities are disproportionately affected as opposed to others.
And my quick statement, I just want to say that like, I just think if more Black and brown folks were given the space to like live and own their truth, that and their pain and like their healing, specifically their healing and their joy, I think there would be a lot of shifts. And I think just anyone is capable of being a part of this. And I think it's about like seeing yourself in that, is like embodying it, educating yourself, and just living that for other people, because that representation will change other people's lives. So I think it's about living your truth and understanding, like for the 80 folks that are still on this, like you're all already here. You're already like so many steps into this that like it's just a matter of like how are you going to take this information and actually like redistribute it, and that's the point.
Thank you all so much. As we bring this conversation to a close, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom and educating all of us. It's just, this has been such a great conversation. And I think, you know, as like, what a way to kick off Columbia Climate Conversations. Just, I hope the audience enjoyed this conversation as much as I did moderating it. And yes, thank you all for sharing. You can drop your Instagram links or anything else that you want to link to in the chat box right now. Someone did ask for book recommendations, so if you'd like to drop that in as well. But that's all that we have for you guys today. So thank you all for tuning in. Big claps for Tori, Christy, and Adithy. And yes, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much. Bye.